Okay, so I am going to kick this off a little bit. Let me see. Did somebody already post the?
Yeah, Brian's agenda item. Should we let him go first?
Yeah, let me post the link here for everybody. If you want to jump into it, this is the call document that we put together for the continuation of the meetings. It has notes, at least since call number 8 in it. This was, an open document. We keep this open between meetings. So anybody who wants to put on agenda items between meetings, feel free. You have edit rights. Please be responsible and don't trash the document, although we have backups of it. So we've had 2 down here. I think Joseph Chow, you wrote the second one, right? About Piper's behind.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So we've had 2 so far on this one. One, Brian wanted to lead a discussion on one topic, and then we had Piper on the second. And honestly, talking about Piper's work is really pretty exciting progress. So I'm hoping we can do that as well. Piper doesn't look so sure, but I think it's quite exciting to see everybody working around some of the cool questions he's raising. But how about we just jump into it in the interest of time? We got started on time this time, which is great. So Brian, are you here? And let me see.
I sure am.
Great. I guess anybody who's having any thoughts that they want to discuss anything, you can feel free to kind of jump in, but also feel free, the document link is there. If you just write into that there, then we can address stuff as we go as well. I see Alexi is on this call, and I don't know, Alexi, if you had some thoughts about anything stateless. I know we've mentioned it in a couple of like one-on-one or one-on-two calls recently, and how much you've been following. So maybe this is a little more catch up of what Piper's been doing.
Yes, I'm just probably going to listen and try to, if anybody says questions, I will answer, but I don't have the active proposals to put in.
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, when people are looking at pulling state and other things, that work is happening in TurboGeth because, you've done a great job on making a tool that allows performant access and so forth. So that's been great. Okay, let's get going. So Brian, I'm going to hand over the microphone to you, and please proceed.
Sounds great. So there were 2 things I wanted to talk about. One of them is gas cost accounting, trying to figure out how we're going to charge for witnesses. And the other one is a proposal called Alaska, which I posted in ETH Research a while ago, and also in Discord and Telegram.
That sounds great. One thing I just realized is, just in case some people on the call may not know other people around, if you could maybe just say a few things about your background. I should say, for anybody who doesn't know anything about my background, I've been heading up some R&D work at Consensus Labs, which is not the part of Consensus that's doing the enterprise stuff, but it's the one that's more future worky and more R&D focused. And there are a couple people who work with me on the call, like Joseph Chow, and Light Client, who's Matt Garnett, is on this call. And Ansgar Dietrichs is on this call as well, and so forth. So Brian?
For sure. Yeah, my background, I've been working with the foundation for, I think, almost 2 years now, which is exciting. Largely on Piper's team, working on Python projects, the Snake Charmers team, we call ourselves. And recently, within the last year, I've been working on more ETH1 focused projects, just trying to figure out like where I can contribute to ETH1, 1x. So that's a brief background. So I wanted to jump into gas cost accounting. I thought it would be useful to sync and see like where we are. There had been a lot of progress earlier in this year. And it seems like we kind of stopped trying to figure out like how we're going to charge our witnesses. If I'm reading the tea leaves right, I haven't talked with Alexi about this, so I could be misunderstanding, but it seems that he had to an extent given up and started to focus more on like just attaching witnesses to transactions because we know how to charge for witnesses that we do it that way. But it seems like in a regime where witnesses are not attached to transactions, where they are attached by miners, we still really don't have any good ideas. And I'd wanted to ask about where everyone's current thoughts are on that. We had some proposals. Alexi had talked about oil, which we had, I think, liked, but thought was quite complicated. And Vitalik had some counter proposals, which I'm not going to lie, I didn't entirely understand. And I wonder how we all feel about them. Does anyone feel like we solved this problem? Does anyone feel like we have good solutions on the pipeline, or we could talk about the solutions we have and what we don't like about them?
Does it sound helpful to cover like what we've looked at and didn't seem like it was going to work? Oil was one. So oil introduced a second unit of accounting. And the idea was that we make oil non-introspectable and gas remains inspectable. The problem was that it didn't actually sidestep the problem, because if there are any costs in oil that exceed the costs for gas effectively, then you still end up with the same problem of effectively making a backwards incompatible gas change. So that one felt like a dead end. There's been a very, on the far other end of the spectrum maybe, was at least one proposal by Vitalik that just bumps gas prices. And it's super simple. And it just doesn't aim to actually account for witnesses in gas as much as just hike up the gas prices for the things that generate witness data. That doesn't give us gas accounting, but it does attempt to capture the cost of witnesses in gas. That one runs into the problem of all gas changes in the upwards direction are backwards incompatible. And so we're stuck with a backwards incompatible change. And we've seen in the past that that is ambiguously problematic. It's basically one of these things where we've been, Mike is probably shaking in his seat right now in terms of how much we've tried to educate people on don't assume that the gas schedule will stay the same, but there's probably things out there that will break.
Piper,
Yeah.
if I may interject. So there is a more elaborate scheme, which also Vitalik is the author behind, and it's 2930. So imagine that we raise the gas costs for S-store or whatever, S-load, towards infinity. But we still maintain these access lists, whereby you can, if you pay for something in an access list, you don't have to pay infinity amount, you pay some reasonable amount instead. And that way, we essentially prevent people from not having access lists. So access list becomes in practice mandatory because you don't have infinite gas. There is no breaking backwards compatibility because anyone can send an access list, and thus you have a way to charge for gas for weekend.
Interesting. I had missed this, and that subtle
Yeah,
extra bit.
Exactly. Yeah, Vitalik pointed out quite early that this is it's a stepping stone towards witness data.
Cool.
One, access lists are great, and we should have them, but mandatory access lists, the problem is they're not decidable. You can't decide a priori what the block hash will be, for example, and who the game winner is. So I think access lists solve a lot of problems, but not everything.
No, that's if you are under the impression that this access list must cover everything, then yes. How can we check that the access list is valid? But these aren't mandatory access lists; they're optional access lists. And if it happens that you touch a piece of data which you had not declared in your access list, then oops, this costs 10 million gas. Sorry, you can't afford that.
And
It
that's
sounds like they're
probably
not optional
something
then.
that sounds like something that we can play with too, where that pricing scheme for when you miss on the access list, like that's a knob that can get turned, right? Where
Yeah.
maybe there is a DSA problem that isn't that's not tractable to solve with an access list, but it's only going to touch 3 pieces of state outside of the list or something like that.
That's why also, yeah, I think that's like a really good point. That's why I think this is like a really elegant solution for just these edge cases that can break by if we increase opcode pricing and someone relied on that, even though that kind of is against best practices. I would feel less comfortable about a solution that would require access list as like the default, at least, where as Martin was just saying, right, there where the non outside of the access list access costs 10 million gas now, which of course it would work, right, from a consensus point, so you don't have the issues of decidability and everything, but it might just break use cases again with the DSA and everything. So I think I like the sweet spot for this access list solution really is in we change gas price, like we could change gas prices as like Vitalik was proposing to a reasonable, just higher amount that just accounts for in some, I don't know, relatively connected way to the increased witness effort that comes with them, and then just use access list as like basically a solution of last resort for these use cases that would break, and potentially also for like general use, but more like, let's see if it's useful for more. So it's like more like we can kind of unbreak these breaking use cases, and then yeah, I would be hesitant to rely on the access list for more than that. But for that, I think they're great.
I want to zoom us back out and run through the tail of the things that we've tried before we go deeper into this one. But thank you for that, because I think it's a good perspective to look at them. There's options there, but the general idea looks promising. We looked at briefly at just actually accounting for the bytes as the witness gets generated and things like that, but that runs into similar problems with oil, as well as just being really complicated, because it means that we're locking essentially the witness format into the protocol, and that didn't seem very, it didn't seem ideal. And then we've looked at just, the trying to shove witnesses into the transactions themselves, and that's where you run into the DSA problem with dynamic state access and not always being able to know what a transaction is going to touch, as well as not knowing when the transaction will be mined and if the witness will still be valid. Did I miss anything there in terms of main approaches that we've looked at?
How about ungas?
Ungas, yes, is definitely the other route that we've looked at, which is, can we just completely make gas non-introspectable, make it invisible at the EVM level? And that one also was just, it looked hard, it's a backwards incompatible change. It's got some, it's maybe the last backwards incompatible change we have to make with respect to gas pricing stuff. But it ruins meta transactions, which is where 2718 came from, to try to sort of set in another mechanism for us to be able to do meta transactions and still put ungas in. But it's a bit of a tangled web there. There's probably a solution down that line that we could find, but it's going to have a bit of complicated interplay between a couple of different changes that we have to make.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. I'd love to dive more into that. It sounds like the biggest problem with ungas was meta transactions. But if we have a alternative mechanism for meta transactions, it sounds like it's actually going to be okay. I'd love to hear what more of the problems were. Maybe before that, I wonder if there are any other major approaches to this problem.
Oh, and it's worth pointing out that ungas doesn't just suddenly give us good gas accounting, but it lets us muck with the gas schedule to do witness gas accounting. So like we still do have to do the thing after that, which is, yeah, accounting for gas and transactions, but it gets a lot easier, I think, if you have ungas and you can just muck with the gas schedule.
Yeah, I think it's a mindset change where you have similar problems where right now, if you move to oil or just if you increase gas prices, you might break some contracts and like you will have the exact same breakage under ungas where like subcalls can fail. But because we moved to ungas, we're now okay with that because clients should know better than to depend on gas.
Yeah, one other
Well, it
point.
still breaks. Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, it still breaks meta transactions, which is really the only use that we found of these protected subcalls that we care about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have to combine it with something to provide meta transactions, like a new transaction type. So you would have ungas and also a way of saying, okay, like do this call with this much gas.
But you were saying, I think you wanted to talk about other solutions first, right? Before the discussions around ungas, okay? Because I also have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I wonder
Yeah,
if
one
there are
other
other,
just
like, yeah.
one other comment I just wanted to make just on the record here is that I think one other interesting point with the witnesses is that I think it's very easy to think about them only in terms of having the right witness so that when a transaction is being included on a minted block, it's valid. But the problem with witnesses is a lot more nefarious than that, because in order for a transaction to propagate on the wire among nodes, the nodes have to have some idea about its validity. And so it kind of requires in the mempool distribution level that each of the nodes that's making a decision about propagating it has the information necessary, meaning that they have enough state that they can tell whether the transaction is a good one or not. So it's going to appear, pretty quickly once a transaction starts wanting to propagate around.
Totally. I believe, if I remember right, I think this one was actually a solved problem where we went through to see what you need to be able to propagate a witness or propagate a transaction. I think all we wanted was a proof that the account had enough balance, and that was a pretty easy thing to be able to prove. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding what you said.
I think it's that the witness can change out from under you. And so if you are stateless, then the handling of the mempool gets a bit more complicated because you effectively have to probably throw away transactions that come in. Like you can't participate with a transaction that doesn't have a witness. And if the witness is old, you also can't propagate it. And so I think that there's some issues that could show up. Like they're maybe not catastrophic, but it means that like the clients might need to continually like rebroadcast their transactions with updated witnesses to keep them in the mempool, because otherwise they're going to fall out of it. Or a benevolent actor does this or something, but like I think that the mempool management, it's a whole separate thing that's going to show up if we end up with transactions that have witnesses paired with them.
Yeah, totally. This sounds right.
I think there's another approach, and I'm not sure if people have looked into it, but has anyone done any work on how it might be possible to refund like the delta of gas that's spent? Like say during the execution, you pay the maximum that you would expect if your transaction was the only transaction to use that witness, and then you add a new processing point at the end of the block where you actually refund some of the gas if the witness is touched multiple times.
Potentially, go for it.
Go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say my operating assumption has been that we're not going to touch that. Whereas it will be nice, we can have smaller witnesses by combining witnesses, but it'll be a lot simpler if we charge transactions for like out of the state that you touch. And then I don't think the refund will be very large in most cases. And so it's probably not worth trying to deal with refunds.
But Matt, are you talking about like, say, 2 transactions from the same account, like sending information, or 2 transactions that like touch the same ERC20 balance or something like that, and sort of how they would?
Yeah. I thought that we were talking about miners or block producers constructing these witnesses. And I thought these witnesses would be, the exact witness, not a per transaction witness. Because I thought per transaction witness is mostly a solved thing. We just charge whatever it costs to include the witness, and that's that.
I think that's kind of what we're talking about here, is that
Okay.
on one side, we'd love it. It'd be cool. There's like some nice properties of miners are generating witnesses. And then there's a bunch of check marks that we have to check for that to be okay, like making sure that they're bounded and that they can do it and things like that. On the other side, it's a lot easier in certain respects if transactions have witnesses attached to them, because it means that miners don't have to do anything else, and that you're sort of shouldering the burden on the people who have the most motivation to make the witness in the first place, the sender of the transaction. It's sort of like, and we might, there could be a world where we end up doing both somehow, but one way or another, we want a witness to show up, and I think we're essentially just trying to figure out how do we do that,
Okay.
while still accounting for it.
I think that redundancy, Regenesis sort of addressed this problem, because the redundant chunks, not just the leaf, but the path up to the leaf, there might be overlap. With pure statelessness, yes, every time. But with Regenesis, it's often the case that you have, the bottom whatever, or however you look at the tree, the near the root, you have everything. But then once you get a little bit further from the Regenesis point, say 10, 100 blocks, a lot of the witnesses are going to be unique, and there's going to be less redundancy. Unless, well, there are some whatever special cases and things, but maybe a contract gets hot or something, or something like this. But I think that this problem is partially solved. That's why I think Regenesis was so popular, because it solved like 10 problems at once, and including this partial witness thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, from the perspective of the miners generating the witnesses, am I correct, Piper, with the perspective that for ETH1 mentality, we feel like having miners generate it is very helpful, but then in ETH2, it's mitigated somewhat with Regenesis, but we want validators to not have to be holding state as they jump among shards. So there's, difficulty there once we finally get to actual execution on the shards. Obviously this won't be an issue if the shards are just data availability, because you don't have to go back and read data for data availability shards.
I think that's right, which suggests that miner generator witnesses are actually suboptimal, like in the longer tail, and that we do want transaction level witnesses, because we want block producers to be able to be stateless, right? And if they're responsible for generating the witness, then we're kind of going against that ethos.
So I think we're getting a little bit off topic here, although I think this is actually an important thing to talk about. We seems to keep running into this wall where we would prefer to do minor attached. We prefer to do transaction attached witnesses. And I think at the very beginning, we kind of knew that doing minor attached was not the ultimate end goal. Like it was going to be kind of we were going the wrong way a little bit to make this easier. But I don't think we've solved, even though eventually we do want to get transaction attached witnesses, this runs into the DSA problem, doesn't it? Like, I think we still haven't, it's a thing we would love to be able to do, but we just haven't figured out how to be able to do yet. Is my understanding wrong here, or does E2 change things?
No, I think you're right. I think minor generated witnesses are not what we want in the ETH2 game, and that we're wanting them attached to the transaction level.
Yeah,
well,
it seems like. Go for it, Matt.
To be fair, I think that, in terms of like the optimal case, the minor witnesses are going to be smaller because you're not going to have any duplicates. And yes, it's harder to generate and it's requiring more resources on the miner, but it could be possible to kind of combine the two, where you as a transaction submitter submit a transaction with the witness, and the miner is kind of incentivized to create this block that has the smallest block witness based on what it receives. And this is like a really complicated problem, definitely, but I don't think it's fair to say that minor witnesses are completely suboptimal.
Totally. And I think it's worth pointing out that these two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. It may make a lot of sense for us to figure it out at the transaction level so that the miner can mine the block statelessly, but part of their responsibility might be aggregating all of the witnesses that the transactions included
Okay.
into a single block level witness, which is then what everybody else in the protocol uses to do stateless block verification.
Also, I think,
I'm guessing here, but that's the shape that might look right.
yeah, also I think like an adjacent idea seems to be right that you could also have like a mixed system where you have different transaction types for transactions with and without witnesses, and then some miners might be stateless and they only accept and process and include those that bring their own witnesses, but some might hold all or some of the state, and then they could just basically also process these other transactions still, so that there could at least be like some transition period or something.
Yeah, Ansgar, I think this too, and Martin, I think this could be done with binding access lists. So you can announce, I promise with this transaction, I will touch only these leaves, and here are the witnesses with them. So I think
that's what
this is exactly.
It still sounds like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place here, where, so I agree that for some transactions you could have binding witnesses and that would allow you to like have transaction attached witnesses. But I still think in the general case, like that's only possible. We can only move to a regime where the only ever witnesses are attached on transactions if we have a massive trade-off where some contracts simply just aren't possible anymore.
So I think maybe I think this is why you and I, Brian, got excited about the concept or like some of the things that were in Alaska. It's not necessarily that it is the solution. The gist of that proposal at the highest level is that you decouple transaction execution from transaction ordering, and that you've got some short window. So what miners do, instead of these are the transactions, execute them, this is the block. What miners do instead is they say, these are the transactions I could find that make sense to tag onto the tail. There's some transactions that other miners already put into this ordered list. I will process as many of those off the front of the list as I possibly can fit into a block, and that is the block that I mine. So they process stuff off the front of the list and they stick stuff onto the tail end of the list. And the idea there is that there's this middle time in which the execution of the future EVM has become completely deterministic. We know it a minute in advance, 30 seconds in advance, 5 minutes, whatever, like that window you can turn the knob. And in that time, you get an opportunity to solve the DSA problem. Like you get a window of opportunity where that corner edge case that we're always stuck on, where there are some kind of contract that has dynamic state access and that cannot predict what it's going to access up front. They could submit a certain transaction of a certain type with a certain budget that says, miner, please fill in my witness for me. This is how much money you have to do that. And they do, and the details of this are something we have to suss out. But the idea here is to give a little bit of time between execution and ordering to fill in a witness.
Isn't this also then non-deterministic though? If I like, of course, I mean, you're right that the details would have to be figured out there. But like, if I'm like 10 transactions away from the current tip of executed transactions, then all 10 before me could either like fail because they did not if they are all this type of they still need the witness transaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then I don't know if the witness will arrive in time or not, and then so I don't know in which actual execution path I will end up with, and so which witness might be the one actually necessary. So
right.
I think
and
at least
taking the determinism, like taking the non-determinism out of that queue it's probably doable. It's gonna be complicated.
I believe that it's definitely doable. I was assuming a regime where miners attach witnesses, and if miners attach witnesses, then you don't need to wait for them to arrive. Like you'll be able to, like as soon as they're included, you'll be able to know what the result will be.
Wait, but then we are back with stateful miners, no?
Right, yeah. I've just been
okay.
assuming that, like, I think non-stateful miners are not possible, and I'm happy to be proven wrong on that.
We don't have to solve stateless mining in this. It isn't a hard requirement for us. We kicked it off of the table and said, like, biting off too much at once. So we don't have to find a solution that's conducive to stateless mining. It's worth thinking about, but it doesn't have to steer our roadmap.
Maybe one last point on that is just wanted to point out, like, because as Paul was saying, right, like that you can at least do this dual system where you basically have a transaction type that has binding access list and a transaction type that has optional access list, and then it's up to the miner to be stateful or stateless and decide, depending on which, it just process only one or both types of these transactions. And at least what I personally find very beautiful about this is that basically would kind of leave it up to the market, right? Where you would just over time see if it makes sense for miners to still like hold the state. If it's more expensive to hold the state, then the additional fees that they collect. If basically rewriting your applications that they are kind of SSA, right? If that is so complicated that most, like a lot of the apps still need these DSA transactions, or if maybe over time they'll all move right due to the economic pressure of only, or even just the usability that only like every fourth block still accepts DSA transactions or something, right? So if it feels like this would just basically in the short term support both, and then the long term basically let the market decide which route to go, or gives us more time to come up with a more elegant solution.
I think it's a great idea.
Just to close it off, I had a post I just posted, stateless mining strategies. That's precisely what Ansgar said was the Martin, I'm glad that we have access lists now. They're not mandatory. They can't be mandatory because of undecidability, but they could be binding, meaning that we already have binding access lists in the form of simple balance transfers. We know the sender and the receiver. We can generalize this to arbitrary, but we require this non-mandatory but binding access list. And then there will be two classes of transactions, with the access list and without. Without might have to be mined with, witness with the block. Yeah, I think we discussed some of these things early last year, and I'm glad we're coming back around to these things. That's it.
Paul, what do you mean by binding?
Okay, you're assigning a transaction. You have a choice. You can include. It's not mandatory to have an access list, but you have a choice. I want to include an access list or not. You do already with simple balance transfers, because just by signing the transaction, you include the receiver and you can recover the sender. Now, if you include an access list, you can make it binding, meaning I promise. I don't know if there would be an extra flag or what. I promise that I will only access leaves or data within this access list, and I will not go outside of this access list. By making this promise, and if you violate this promise, your transaction is invalid. So it would be a validity rule violated at execution time. Did I explain what I meant by binding?
Yeah. So yes, you did. But essentially, so if the gas costs were infinite, if it was outside of the access list that was declared, wouldn't that be same kind of binding? Or would it be a different kind of binding, since it would actually make the transaction valid, just not runnable? It would never run to completion.
Yeah, there's this edge case of yes.
Because I mean, there's different kinds of validity. In your form of binding, I take it to mean that that someone first has to determine whether or not the transaction is valid. If it touches something out of bounds, then nothing is actually deducted, and all that examination was not paid for, which is a problem.
I think
that's
that's what
solvable in terms of like charging for the gas in the access list upfront. It's like you can count how many things are in there. You can charge that's like the intrinsic gas cost. If it didn't provide enough gas, then it's invalid. And then in the event that it touches something outside of that, the whole transaction is reverted, but they're still charged for all of the
I think that's the important property. So I think that's what Paul, what you were saying with like the decidability, right? So you cannot do the access list variant where the transaction is invalid if it accesses outside the access list, because then you run into all these issues. But it's basically like a valid but like a failing transaction. So and I personally prefer the variant where the miner would be free to still provide the state that's missing, but basically if a block has like one of these binding access list transaction types and they access state outside, like they try to access state that's not provided either by the transaction or by the miner, then it just fails, but it still has to be paid for. And then the other way, like the non-binding access list transaction, that would be the other way around. So if that were to access state that's not provided, then that would be a minor mistake. And so then in that case, the whole block would be invalid. So I think those would basically be the two cases.
Are we mixing up access lists and witnesses here? I feel like half of us are saying access lists when we mean witness and vice versa.
Yeah, make a good point. I think that one of our design goals for statelessness is that there's a one-to-one correspondence with access, with leaves and witnesses. There are subtleties, and I can explain them if we have time. But yes, I think that there should be a design goal, whatever our binary, our Merkleization rule, our binary tree format, our regenesis, whatever. Our design goal is there's a one-to-one correspondence with access list items, the leaf and the witness to the leaf.
I've been drawing the distinction at we're gonna have some format for a witness that we pass over the wire, and we're gonna have some concept of an access list it's an access list. And in the consensus protocol, we probably only deal with access lists, and in the networking layer, we deal with both. But the witness is something you can generate directly from the access list, and the idea is not to bake the witness format, which is going to be intrinsically tied to the tree format and the Merkleization rules and things like that, back into the protocol. So
if I send the transaction over the wire and only send an access list and I never bother to send the witnesses, what happens to that transaction?
Well, so the transaction probably has an access list encoded in it, but the over the wire portion might have the witness alongside of it. So
I see. So I would just not get propagated if I didn't include the witness.
I mean, we're making things up as to what the protocol might look like, but yes, that's, I think, roughly what it would look like.
Micah, that's precisely what the Great Alaska Pipeline, that's what happened precisely. We wouldn't include the witness. We would just include the access list, and the witnesses are to be propagated. Perhaps we would need the witness to that account so we can check the nonce and check the balance, and that we can make the transaction, things like this. But that's precisely the point, to not include the witnesses, just include, and then let the Alaska Pipeline. By the way, this Alaska Pipeline, there was a post and I had something almost identical. I called it consensus transaction pools. And I'm glad that these ideas are coming up independently. Maybe that means they're good ideas, but that's the point, Micah, that we have we don't include it. So then we allow that critical time when the block propagates, it doesn't have to include witnesses. Those can propagate later. And the consensus transaction pool, or the Great Alaskan Pipeline, whatever you want to call it, will allow a delayed execution, during which time, the non-critical time, the witnesses will be propagated. So that solves a few problems as well.
Okay. I wanted to ask, if stateless mining isn't necessary, why can't the miner attached witnesses just be done again? Just require that.
Yeah. I think there should be a block limit because there's a critical moment. When you mine the block, you want it to propagate fast, or perhaps you want it to be big for whatever reason. I think that we should have both, and the miner can do it, but I think that the block, there should be, I don't want to use the word discount, I don't want to back ourselves into a corner, but there should be a higher cost to including witnesses in the block. For example, if it has to be included, if there's not an undecidability, or if they don't have the binding access list with the transaction, they have to be included with the block. But I imagine that those, and we discussed this, I think at FCC, those transactions would be more expensive. So there would be incentive for the dApp devs to make everything deterministic, and so that they allow access lists to be decided a priori, But the dice games would have, the witnesses would have to be included with the block. That's my vision of it. I don't know, maybe I don't want to force that, but that's, I think, a nice solution to a lot of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of the goal with regenesis, is to have a certain amount of state that's assumed in the light miner case that they can attach. And then there's various mechanisms of, you know, how we can deal with more expensive later state getting back in. One thing I wanted was, I definitely wanted, I don't want to, well, I did want to, you know, have an opportunity for Piper to give a little bit of description about some of the good work.
No, let's do that next week, Robert, because we should continue this discussion. We only have 15 minutes left, I think.
Oh, okay. I thought it was kind of wrapping
no, my one was there only if there was time, but this is an important topic, so we should continue on this. Thanks.
Okay.
I'm unsure if so I don't think that we're going to make a decision. Like, we're not going to figure this out on this call. I have this short list of like problems that kind of have to be solved here for us to figure out witnesses, which are basically dealing with the DSA thing. You know, there's going to be transactions that you can't predict. Dealing with the mempool. If there are witnesses flowing around with transactions, they potentially have to be updated, and that's a weird problem to deal with. The binding versus non-binding access lists seem like a pretty nice direction, but one of the other bits is in the actual validation of transactions that, that I guess that's the same thing with the mempool, which is that we were talking about making it possible for not necessarily miners, but for clients to participate in the protocol in a stateless way. And the mempool is dependent on all clients, on all nodes on the network being able to validate transactions. And so if we make transactions stateless, we've got work to do on the mempool itself, because right now it has an implicit assumption of state access in order to be able to validate transactions. And then there's just the core thing, which is we have to charge for this stuff. We want to charge at the protocol level for the witness information, which is the access list, and in theory, the underlying witness itself, to be sent around the network.
For those of us that are a little slower, can you give a quick reason why the mempool requires validation? Right now, the mempool doesn't actually run transactions. It just looks to see if they format it correctly.
But it checks if they can pay for them. And so if you did stateless, if we did a bad version of this in which transactions got just propagated around, one of the things that clients do is check that they calculate the intrinsic gas, and then they check that the account has enough money to pay for that. Similarly, nonce stuff, they make sure that it's not an old nonce, and a lot of them probably that it's not like a way far in the future nonce as well.
Couldn't we solve that by just having certain pieces of witness are always required, and those are ones that don't run the DSA problem, like nonce and balance of the sender account?
Yes, these are totally solvable problems. But say it's a congestion period and I broadcast my transaction over MetaMask or whatever, and it lands in the mempool, and it has a small proof against a recent state root that my account has the right balance, but it doesn't get included for 100 blocks. Is that proof who's going to update?
I see. Okay, so someone else can change your balance. So the nonce problem is only you can change, but the balance someone else can change. Okay.
Right. Or yeah.
No, but also in the right direction, only in the right direction, right? Your balance can only ever go up, so you can never make a valid transaction invalid. But it just might, yeah.
Yeah, previously we talked about this. I think we had all decided that this was a solvable problem. I just posted a link to our previous discussion on this.
One thing I just wanted to point out, if people are looking at the chat or not, Danny wrote a good note here, which is capturing a thought I was going to interject as well, which was there's definitely, I think, a useful context here, which is that I think it's definitely conceivable that statelessness won't get into the protocol until around the merge or potentially after the merge. And so looking at what ETH, the ETH1 execution chain needs to do for statelessness in an ETH2 mindset, Danny is kind of pointing out again that, it is, although ETH2 has this idea of shards kind of jumping around and so forth, assuming that the ETH1 shard on ETH2 is still a singular chain, then, we can still, put requirements around stateful, heavier state for the miners to be holding than if this was like true execution in ETH2, where validators would be jumping around between shards more. And then even then, I didn't realize these were the numbers. So that's helpful to just keep in mind again that the current estimates for ETH2 reshuffling of shards is once per day with a 1-day look ahead. So that is actually longer than I thought. I didn't realize it was that long that shards would have in order to look for, even if the ETH1 chain was running on multiple shards, that would still leave a lot of time to catch up to the last regenesis checkpoint, for instance.
Yeah, I thought that those timelines were going to be a lot shorter, minutes, hours, bouncing around quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a combination here of definitely, regenesis allowing there to be kind of a shorter time frame where you could assume that, either all miners or most miners are, holding state. But like Ansgar is saying, and it also was in some of the previous discussions, Ansgar is just bringing up again this point of, allowing miners to opt in to either adding state or to requiring transactions to have full state witnesses, and letting the market decide kind of how much it's worth so that you can, pick which mechanism. That's kind of powerful. I guess if I wanted to extrapolate that up one point, I mean, if you're a person who has a wallet and you hold all the state necessary for a transaction and your transaction is SSA, so you're able to, commit a state witness that's good for all time, you can, put it in and, that state witness is going to be valid the whole time your transaction's in the mempool. On the other hand, if you put it in and somebody along the chain, a relayer or the first miner that you hit from RPC before it goes on the wire among potential miners, adds a state witness, that's another spot. And then obviously the miners can be adding it there. So there's a couple different spots. And from an economic standpoint, this is just extrapolating that point that Ansgar is bringing up again. If the protocol allows people to be incented to add state at different points, then it allows the market to sort of give users a choice of, which cost profile they would like to choose. I don't know to what extent. I mean, the problem that I keep hearing that you guys, and I definitely have seen also, is that when we think about the edge cases, that's where we get kind of caught. But, I don't know, there's that end-to-end argument if you punt it back to the user of, trying to put in a transaction with the right amount of money to pay the right people or take care of it yourself, then you don't necessarily have to solve everything in the protocol because the user is the, intelligent person who can make their choices and, hopefully make sure their transaction gets in eventually.
I would love to use the last 6 minutes to just quickly touch the thing that I'll talk about next time, because it's a bigger idea and I want to at least hope I infect somebody with it. And it's right along with all of this in terms of trying to figure out how statelessness and users and everything work. The conclusion I have come to is that the stuff that we are working on this group is really important, but it only gets us stuff that works really well at the protocol level and gives us really nice stateless infrastructure, and it's useless to everybody else. That everybody who uses Ethereum like that we cannot build a useful stateless client based on what we are talking about doing in this group. We can build a piece of infrastructure that'll hold the network up, but the client will not be useful at all. And that's because the client won't be able to send transactions and it won't be able to generate witnesses because you can't get at the state. So we're building stuff into the protocol right now that allows the protocol to like merge into ETH2 and be stateless at its like core level. But the functionality stops at the protocol, and the use of the protocol is still not viable. And my assertion here is that we want stateless clients, and for a stateless client to be useful, it's got to be able to send transactions. And if you want to send transactions, then you have to be able to participate in the mempool, and you have to be able to estimate the gas for the transaction, and maybe you have to be able to generate a witness for the transaction. And all three of those things require on-demand access to the state, whether or not it's your own copy or this magical network that I want to build. The ETH protocol is not well suited for this, and we also probably don't want to change it a lot because the ETH protocol is what holds up the core of the network. I wrote a bunch of blog posts. I gave a talk. If you want to go listen to them or read them or whatever, it'll outline a lot of this. I'll probably talk about it in our next call. But I think that there is a very necessary and probably equally large component of work to be done to actually make stateless useful at the client level. And if we don't do that work, I'm not sure that the work that we're doing here is going to matter that much, because the clients won't be able to be stateless. Because if they do, no, you won't be able to use them for anything. Yes, you can turn them on and they'll help hold the network up in some sense of the word, but they won't be able to expose the JSON RPC API, and you won't be able to send transactions through them, and they won't be able to participate in the transaction pool, assuming we don't make systemic changes to that. So the things that have to be figured out, I'll go into those later, but there's a bunch of other work that's going to have to be done, I think, it's my assertion, in order for us to enable clients to be truly, I mean, it's neat if we can have a client that's stateless at the protocol level and executes blocks, but if it can't do anything, then it's not really that useful. And we shouldn't expect the clients to adopt these protocol things because they don't actually gain them anything. That's the gist. It's like, to get into specifics is gonna eat up the last 2 minutes in a moment. But there's a talk you can watch. There's 3 blog posts that I wrote that are all essentially just a 3-parter of the same thing, trying to stab at this idea.
Yeah, I think maybe it's useful just to point out that, like, currently, wallets which are clients are stateless in the sense that they rely on Infura or something. But what you're talking about here is, a version of the clients where the clients basically, encapsulate the Infura functionality in a decentralized way, right?
Yes, it's that if Geth built in a stateless mode that was built on these protocols where, changes we're talking about doing, that it would either need something new or to depend on Infura in order to be able to send a transaction. Because, yeah.
Does the solution you imagine look something like Nethermind's data marketplace?
No, I do not think that an incentive-based solution is going to get us very far. I think that there's a lot of room for incentive-based solutions, but I am looking for a non-incentive-based solution that allows for really, really awesome, ultra lightweight clients.
Before we end, I want to ask, because part of this discussion seemed to me that, some of it needs to occur more often. Like historically, these calls are, once a month. But some of the people here could really benefit from, like more frequent calls. Like, for example, Ansgar on our team he'd benefit, I think, but the whole group as well would benefit if we call it like a witness working group or something like that. So my question is, for these more frequent things, are there ways that we can help facilitate that? Or because I think it is good to have just a monthly call, like where we can talk about the topics at a higher level, but we need maybe weekly or even more often, like working group kind of calls.
I won't commit everybody to a weekly or bi-weekly call at this point, but if we want to meet next week or the week after that to continue this and to talk kind of more about I would be happy to give everybody what I've come to think is what we need to be doing, or the extra work that still needs to be done also.
I would love to see that, because I think that apart from the theoretical issues, what you've been discussing, Piper, and I know you've communicated, and a number of us have kind of been thinking about it as well, that there's an architecture in terms of different kinds of networks of state, and there's the pull side of reading the state from it, and then there's this other thing which we were really talking about in the witness, which is kind of adding back the state as needed as it propagates in. So it's kind of a state writing network, and just having that picture, which, as Joseph is saying, can get kind of broken up into working groups once there's a common framework of this picture is the ground that we're operating on.
Yeah.
Quite helpful.
And I think that there are units of usefulness in the network design that I'm looking at that might make some of this stuff with how do miners mine blocks statelessly more feasible. So 1 to 2 weeks, I don't know how to get signaling for this, but we shouldn't necessarily decide on this call. Let's throw it in the channel and get something scheduled for 1 or 2 weeks out and see if that's going to work.
Yeah, that sounds good. We'll schedule something in the next week or two as a follow-on to this, and we're not going to call it like a regular thing because it's really as needed, but I think it's reasonable at this point to see if we have enough that we can have
Can I make a suggestion about this sort of scheduling more calls? So we actually talked with Tim about it recently. One of the problems with the regular calls is that it's sort of hard to predict what will be discussed, and some people don't want to come to every single one because they might not be so interested in what has been discussed. So perhaps the better approach is do have more regular calls, but to have the different topics discussed in each of them, rather than trying to bundle everything in every single call, and more often than not missing part of it. Then just say, okay, let's do one topic per call, and then we will chart them out in advance so people can come to the discussion they really want to participate, rather than having to slog through every single week. And basically it's better that to have people really come prepared and focused for fewer calls than to have them essentially burn out and not come and turning up anymore after like a few weeks. So maybe we could, I know that it does require a much more prior work for organization, but yeah, that's my suggestion.
Maybe even instead of
I'm a strong agree.
Maybe even instead of that replacing these regular calls, we could also just kind of see if we can form some working groups on some of these topics, and then have those just meet independently, and then every now and so often just kind of report back in these big calls, these occasional ones or something.
Yeah, I think having them as like working groups on specific topics, Alexi, that's right on. And
no, I'm not suggesting the working groups, because I know that we tried working groups as well, and I didn't manage to make this work. So I'm simply suggesting to have group calls, but at the one topic at a time, and predetermined. Like, for example, Piper's the discussion at this date, Great Alaskan, what is it called? Great Alaskan Pipeline that day, because we haven't even talked about it today, right? Have you noticed?
Yeah. Thank you.
So,
Thank you for catching that. I shouldn't say working
Yeah.
group, because I also agree that working group has too much permanency to it. It's more of having a well-described agenda. People can opt in. The other closing part for it, I think that if we do those topic discussions, then yeah, we can try to actually have a summary to allow people to catch up for the next topic and so on. So, you know, to the extent that we can do that, that would be cool. Okay, all right. So we will we'll set down a couple of topics, and again, I think for that part also, if we can, yeah, we'll kind of suggest it. Let's go through it in the chat, Piper and others, and you know, if people have ideas for that, we'll open it up as kind of a document with discussion around it, so we can kind of decide as a group what we want to have in these more frequent topic-focused discussions.
Perfect.
All right. Hey, thanks everybody for sticking on so long. This was really informative for me. I hope for other people who are just trying to follow along, it's helpful. A lot of really good ideas, and I think we can coalesce.
Thank you very much for doing it. Bye.
Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye all.
Thank you. All right.